Who would have thought all this jabber happens when you get a bunch of historians and old DFHers and old retired military guys together? It's fun. It's great to see everybody. I mean, this is, for a lot of us, geez, I haven't seen some of you folks in years, and it's great to see you back here for this great gathering, and tomorrow night is going to be real special. Next up is our foundation chair, John Barry. He's going to talk about Columbia and his role in the investigation after it's over. Fascinating talk. There won't be any questions because he assures me he's going to take exactly to 9:55. So when you talk about the technology that we're going to get into with space, as with anything, and it was Gene McCall who used to say, well, if you succeed 80% of the time and you fail 20%, that means you're trying. And so that when you look at new technologies, I've always thought of it that way from my time on the Scientific Advisory Board with Dr. McCall. So here is General Barry.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And also as Chair, I want to welcome you all to this event today. And also hopefully a lot of you will be joining us tomorrow night for the banquet. It's going to be an amazing event here. And what a great venue. I mean, you can't ask for a better venue as you go forward. All right, as an old fighter pilot, you can't begin anything without telling a story. So, you know, I'm a little intimidated by the quality of the people here in the room here as we go forward. So the story goes something like this. There's three gentlemen in London, and they're boarding a train, and, you know, they get into a compartment. And, you know, after a while, the train pulls out, and one feels obligated to introduce himself. He says, Ruli here, retired brigadier, married, 2 sons, both doctors. So now that the first guy's introduced himself, the other guy, he says, he's going to introduce himself. He says, Thompson here, retired brigadier, married, 2 sons, both lawyers. Now the third guy's a little chagrined about the bombastic attitude of these two, and he's thinking about what he's going to say, and finally he figures out he's going to introduce himself. He says, McGrilly here, retired sergeant major, never been married, 2 sons, both brigadiers. So always know your audience as you go forward. So anyway, this is a story about Columbia. Now, just to make it clear, Challenger happened in 1986. Columbia happened in 2003. But the historic significance of this and the lessons learned that we learned. Now, I was on the board. There were 13 members of the board. It was run by Admiral Chuley. I was the executive director as well as a board member. It took us a year to put this thing together, and of course we all remember what happened there, and it was such a horrific event. So what I'm going to try to do is capsulize some of the key lessons learned on this thing as we go forward. So this is what I'm going to cover a little bit about the causes. So there's really 2 parts of the briefing. One is the technical, and one is the culture, management, and organization. Let me tell you a little story. When we started the investigation, you know, those of you who are in the military, if you're ever involved in an investigation for any kind of an aircraft accident or any kind of accident, you know, you bring people together, you find out the widget that broke, you find the persons involved in it, you know, and the second investigation sometimes brings up culpability and so forth and so on. It's interesting, we found a book that was written by someone in Canada. His name was, McGraffey. And it had nothing to do with aviation, had nothing to do with space. It was when these 2 brothers who were in charge of basically chlorinating and making sure the water in this really rural town in Canada was done well, and they didn't do a good job. And a lot of people got sick in the town, and 6 children died. It was a big controversy in Canada in 1981. So what they did was interesting, because instead of just finding the widget that broke and the people who were responsible for it, like a lot of investigations are, they looked at the whole process. They looked at the training for those 2 brothers that were responsible for it. They looked at the status and the organization. They made it all the way to, like, the Department of Interior in the United States, to the cabinet, all the way to the Prime Minister. I mean, they looked at the whole process. That's exactly what we did with the investigation with Columbia. Instead of just looking at the widget that broke and finally who was guilty and those kinds of things, we wanted to look at the whole concept. So that's what we ended up doing, very unique, and it really shook NASA up a little. Now, I want to make one thing clear. If we talked about all the things that went on with NASA, I mean, we could spend, you know, hours and hours of amazing stories and terrific stuff that went on in the decade of not only the 60s and the 70s and the 80s on forward. But on this particular case, as it was in Challenger in 1986, it's not a good story. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to go through here. What we did, and we made this pretty clear about a month into the investigation, it took a whole year to be able to put this report together. And one of the things that we wanted to make clear, that it wasn't just the technical aspect of what happened here. There were two causes for this accident. Obviously, there's something went wrong, mechanically, and something culture, management, and organization failed. And when we really made that pretty clear, it did shake up NASA quite a little bit. When we said there was not just one cause for this accident, there were two, and they were both equal, all right? So let's talk a little bit about that. The accident and why the accident occurred. Now, this is, I've got two slides, a lot of words, and this is the last time I'll show you that. But the bottom line is 81 seconds after launch, a piece of foam. Now, those of us who have flown fighters or flown fast aircraft, no kind of thing, if you hit a bird, it can rip your head off. It hits the canopy at the wrong place. 2.2 pounds of foam came off the shuttle, and I'll show you exactly where that was. It broke into three pieces, and 1.2 pounds of foam hit the shuttle in the left wing, and enough to damage it. So on reentry, the heat that just ate away at that one piece took away the structural failure, and we lost the shuttle and the crew. So that's the technical cause in a short answer, and that's what those words say. The second one is the organization, culture, and management. And this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time on lessons learned on this, because I've given this briefing to atomic energy plants, to school districts, to universities, to mining organizations, hospitals. You can talk about NASA and SpaceX and all the different organizations that I've spoken to, from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. But the bottom line is these lessons are applicable to any organization, right? And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. Well, we first want to recognize the young people that we lost, and obviously 7 great Americans, 7 people, and one of which was an Israeli astronaut, okay? And Rick Husman was his second time in space, Willie McCool, first time. Casey Chawla was actually an Indian-born but an American citizen, and she was on her second flight. Laurel Clark was her second, Dave Brown's first, Mike Anderson's first, and then Ilya Ramon. A little quick story about that. When we first got together, the accident happened, and the next day we were assembled. There were only 13 of us, but at the beginning there's only 6 of us on the board. And Nacogdoches is where we gathered in Texas, where a lot of the debris came down. And I remember we got together and we kind of held hands and we said, said a little prayer, just whatever we can find out that hopefully will determine so this could never happen again. Well, as soon as we found out that Ilya Ramon was one of the astronauts, we started digging into it. Well, it turns out that Ilya had an interesting story. He was an F-16 pilot. And if you remember in 1980, Israel attacked the Baghdad reactor, right? I happened to work for Cheney when he was Secretary of Defense. I was his military assistant. And I can remember him calling up, this is 1990, 91, remember, for Desert Storm. He called the Minister of Defense in Israel and thanked him for taking out the Baghdad reactor, okay, in 1980. Ilya Ramon was number 4 of the second force ship that dropped 2,000-pound bombs from high altitude, and took out the Baghdad reactor. So immediately when you go to that, oh my God, it had to do something with terrorism or sabotage or something like that. I want you to imagine a room that was twice the size of this thing and twice as high. And we had all these decision trees. And we're eliminating these things one at a time as we went through this whole thing. Everything from space debris hit the shuttle, in flight. Maybe this was a mission, I'll tell you, it was a science mission. And there's a little bit of story behind that too. But the bottom line was that when we went through all these decision trees and eliminated all these different things, there was only one cause left, and that was the foam. And it came off at 81 seconds after flight and hit the left wing and caused the fracture. It wasn't sabotage, it wasn't terrorism, and there was a number of other things I'll show you here that we eliminated right off the bat. Just to give you a refresher course a little bit, this was the 113th mission of the space shuttle program, and Columbia is 26. Now, Columbia was the first shuttle. It flew in 1981. This is 2003. It's already 22 years old. And originally, when the shuttles were designed, they were supposed to fly 10 missions a year each. And eventually there were 4 shuttles. We lost one, obviously, with Challenger, and then we lost one again with Columbia. But this was on January 16th, and it was, interestingly enough, a science mission. It wasn't a mission that went to the space station. Now, if you're an astronaut and you were asked to say, you could either go up and fly and have a space, a science lab in the back and fly around the Earth a little bit and then come back, or go to the space station, which one do you think they'd want to do? They'd raise their hand and do the space station. And that became important, too, because it really showed the priority of where NASA's thinking was, okay? And that also played into the culture management organization process. But this was January 16th on a 16-day mission, just science. And unfortunately, in some regards, the priority for this mission kept getting postponed. Usually when you assemble a crew of astronauts, some of you know this, you get priority on the T-38 flights, you get priority on the simulators for 6 months, and then you go fly. Well, they did that, and then they got bumped. And then they got bumped again. And why? Because they're going to the space station, okay? So the eyes and the priorities and, the focus wasn't exactly on this one. Now, this crew had been together for a year and a half, okay, before they actually got to fly in space. And the shuttle, just to real quickly, it's the size of the Washington Monument, to give you an idea, And you have the external tank. I'm going to talk about why this thing is orange. 2 solid rocket motors that help it get off. And solid rocket motors, they just light up and they expend. There's no control. There's no throttle up and throttle back. It just, when they finish expending after, a certain amount of time, basically 8 minutes, separates, and then the external tank with the liquid fuel goes ahead and takes over from the start to the finish of getting the shuttle up into space. Now, the external tank is liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and super cooled to sub-temperatures. Now, can you imagine, one of the things that I want to make sure is, and explains why this thing is orange on the external tank, is that when you got a super cooled thermos bottle in the middle of Florida, what's going to happen? You're going to have ice forms, and what they did was to be able to solve that problem, because when it was originally designed during the Nixon era, the shuttle is actually on the top, kind of like what we see now and what we saw during Apollo, as a case in point. But because of money, and it was redesigned to be put on the side. Well, you can see that if ice forms on the top part of the external tank, the orange part, the large one there, with the supercooled oxygen and hydrogen, you're going to have ice formed, and if ice comes off, it could damage the shuttle. Well, it turns out the protector killed the shuttle because the whole external tank is covered with foam, as a case in point. So we'll talk some more about that. Okay, so what we did was Admiral Gaiman, we called the Gaiman test, was the head of it. He was a 4-star, and there were 4 flag officers. I was one of them, the executive directors, my other job as well as that. But then we had Nobel Prize winner, we had a former Secretary of the Air Force. We had a number of quality people that were on the investigation team. And what we did was we really went through aerodynamic, thermodynamic, timeline, imagery, debris evidence, all the way across the line to be able to come to the conclusion that the foam killed the shuttle. So let's talk a little bit about what did happen. This is what came off, and I'll show you exactly where that is here in just a minute. This popped off, 81 seconds after flight, on January 16th, just pretty early in the morning. And this is what it kind of looked like. Now, it's interesting, we had a gentleman, a lot of people volunteered to help us out, and this guy comes in and says, just give me the data and I can do this video for you. This video is to the point. You can see the height, the airspeed, the Mach numbers, all that other stuff. And here is the piece that came off, okay? There are 2 connections for the shuttle. External tank is where the solid rocket motors were attached, as well as the external tank. So there were 2 bipod connections on the top, 2 bipod connections on the bottom that connected the shuttle to the external tank. And this thing pops off at 81 seconds. You can see right now we're at 65,000 feet, Mach 2.5, ready for this thing to come off. And I said 2.2 pounds of foam popped off, and it broke into 3 pieces. Now the smaller pieces kind of did a skip hit off the wing, but the 1.2 pounds of foam hit the panel number 8 of the Space Shuttle leading edge of the orbiter. Now, just for demonstration purposes, we kind of highlight that area there so you can all can see. But now, that's about 2 minutes is when the solid rocket motor separates. So we're not quite at 2 minutes yet. We're 1 minute and 22 seconds, and this speeds up now, and it'll pick up. And then after 2 minutes, the solid rocket motor is separated, from the shuttle. And again, this is speeded up for time. And then once that's done, then the external tank with the liquid fuel is propelling the shuttle up to orbit. And you'll see where it ends up. And then when that 8 minutes is up from launch, from start to finish, the external tank, they roll it over, they jettison over the water, and that's destroyed on reentry, and it's not recovered. The solid rocket motors come down in parachutes and actually are reused again, as a case in point. So Columbia, now 22 years in the making. Here's the trajectory that basically it took out this way towards the ocean, in case something bad happens. Actually, obviously this happened. This is interesting. The video, Columbia was the first shuttle. It had more sensors on it than any of the others because of the first capability they wanted to do it. A lot of those sensors didn't work by 22 years later. And they didn't need all that data. And there was a whole lot of cameras on the ground that used to take pictures of the shuttle. There wasn't a lot during this time because it was kind of getting into a routine. And that's another thing we'll talk about later, about how that kind of got to a point where it'd been there, done that, got the T-shirt a little bit. So here's so a day after they started reviewing the film that was taken from this one camera. And, basically, let me just show you. So you can see where it comes off. Now this is repeated for demonstration purposes, but you can see it's a pretty good slam, all right? Now, here's another interesting story. They had basically a computer program that made an analysis if and when they ever had any strikes on the shuttle, and it was called Crater. It was designed in the 1970s. Remember, the shuttle started Columbia in 1981. This is 2003. And they're still using this Crater software program. And the guy and the young man who did it was moving from California to Kennedy Space Center. He got briefed on how to use the Crater. This is before the accident. And he was taught how to use it by a webinar in those days, believe it or not. And he did it. He made an analysis and concluded that it was not a structural failure or a risk to the shuttle. You know how you take a rock and you throw it on the water and the skip hits? Low angle of incidence, low angle of impact, That's what he saw. That's what he concluded. That's what he briefed. NASA took it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about PowerPoint briefings and how things can get out of hand sometimes. So they ended up talking to Rick Hutzman, and they did tell him that there was a strike, but we've concluded that's not a safety of flight. So from then on, except for a few other talks that I'll talk about, I call it water cooler conversation that went on. Basically, as far as the crew was concerned, they were told it wasn't a factor. So they never knew that they were at risk, okay? Short of just saying, hey, there was something came up, we determined that it wasn't a massive hit, it's not a safety of flight, and we can go from there. So this is kind of where, the cameras, there were 2 videos, cameras, I just showed you one, but this is where they were situated to be able to track that. So this is the bipod that popped off, and this is what is underneath that bipod. There's a connection junction point from the shuttle to the external tank, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and go from there. Now here's another thing too. Michoud is just outside New Orleans, and this is where the external tank was made. And I'm going to tell you a quick story here, but the bottom line was they had already pre-built a whole bunch of external tanks in preparation for future launches, you know. So after this accident was done, we obviously had a pretty good investigation team, and they went out to Michoud, and they actually took an external tank that had already put the bipods on there with the rods connecting, not obviously to the external tank yet. I mean, with the external tank, but not to the shuttle. And we tore it apart. And we did about 3 of them. And we found some vacant pockets of on the bipod that wasn't completely filled in. We found a rag in one of them, as a case in point. So there's a number of things that really got our attention that, you know, this wasn't done as well as we would have liked. Can you imagine when you do this, you spray it, and George sprays it this way, and Mary sprays it that way. They did it in humidity-controlled environments, and they did it in a very structured manner, but each one of those were unique in some way or another. So it was one of those things where this is, I'm going to tell you right now, this happened a shuttle launch before Columbia, okay? And it was a lot of signals that were presented, but this is where the hit was, right there in the left wing. There's 24 of these leading edge parts of the shuttle, and they're connected. They cost $800,000 a piece. They took 6 months to cure, and it's a carbon-carbon. It's amazing technology. You know, and it was really demonstrated to me. You know, we were getting a briefing, and this guy shows us this microwave. It looked like a microwave to me, but it was bigger. He put a piece of the carbon-carbon in there. He dialed it up to, 7,000 degrees. It went right up to 7,000 degrees. He hit the, button to stop it, opened the door, and with a bare hand went in and pulled it out. I mean, this carbon-carbon was built this was designed in the 1970s. And these 24 panels on each side of the shuttle were connected and sealed. You can see how they're sealed here, But it's an amazing technology because, when you see like Apollo 13, capsules coming in, the heat's hitting the bottom part of the capsule. Think of it as cork, but it's obviously more sophisticated. There's always enough cork there that it's going to burn off, but it's not going to put the crew at risk, okay? Well, there was no cork to burn off on the shuttle. They had this carbon-carbon that re-radiated the heat, okay? And that's how it worked. And how it still works on what we're doing right now with space launches as a case in point. But here's the interesting thing. I had no idea about this technology, and started asking questions. And then, finally I found out a lot more about it. And you see how it kind of bends around here? And they're connected with these seals, these T-seals and RCC panels and spanner beams, and because you obviously don't want any heat getting in there, as a case in point. Well, I had a bunch of astronauts together, God love them. They got a lot to think about. And I asked a question, one time. I said, how thick do you think that leading edge of that panel is? And I got answers like, well, it's 3 inches, 4 inches thick. It's 1/4 of an inch thick. It's amazing. However, if it was any thicker, it wouldn't re-radiate the heat well. And if it was any thinner, it'd obviously be a structural issue. That panel that got hit was the same panel that was on the shuttle in 1981. Now, they did a great job of inspecting them. It wasn't, don't get me wrong about that. It wasn't any malfeasance or anything like that. But bottom line is, this thing had been on there since 1981, 22 years. And not taken off and put back in again. Now, they had to do that a couple of times, but it wasn't this panel. And it wasn't routinely done. Now, this is where it hit, right here, panel number 8. Between 8 and 9 is our best guess. Now, what you need to know is the shuttle does not carry any fuel inside the wing, like airplanes, okay? In fact, first time I went inside a shuttle, I actually walked around the wing inside. All I had to do was stoop down a little bit, and I could walk around almost the whole thing. So it's vacant inside. So when it hit that part, it went through the wall, it penetrated inside on reentry, and I'll talk about it. But it was damaged enough. We're sure it's not a big crack, You know, it wasn't a big hole, or it wouldn't have made it up into orbit, but it was enough of a fractional risk to the structure that when you re-entered 7,000 degrees, hitting that puppy, you know, just ate away at it, and that's what ended up causing the shuttle to be lost. Now, some idiot put something on the internet showing an explosion of the shuttle in flight. Of course, it's in a vacuum, didn't have any fuel. The only fuel it had after it got to orbit was retro rocket fuel to be able to roll it upside down and right side up. I'll talk a little bit about that. But this thing here, I'm going to talk about the MADS recorder. This is a reel-to-reel. Now, some of you young people in the audience don't remember what the heck that was, you know. But there were a bunch of reel-to-reels on the shuttle, and I told you there's no black box on the shuttles, okay? The shuttle was a flying sensor. It had sensors all over. I'll show you how many here in just a little bit. And some of them were reel-to-reel. So you didn't get the data until the shuttle was on the ground. You pulled the reel-to-reel out. But there was one that we really wanted to get, and I'll remind me to tell you a story about that as we get forward. But it's incredible to think that this was 2003, still using reel-to-reel analog. And I want to tell you a reason why the shuttle was analog. Why wasn't it digital by 2000? I mean, I fly an airplane still that has the glass cockpit. You know, it's got glass panels. I'm going to knock you. I'm going to keep you guys awake. That's how I'm going to do that. Yeah. So never trust a fighter pilot with his hands. So anyway, the bottom line is that the technology at the time for analog is still important to know, because even on the space station today, when we have these sunbursts that come out, you know, periodically, they have to shut down all the laptops, because when that stuff goes through, it'll take out the laptops. So they kept the shuttle pretty analog all the way across the line, including, as I mentioned, a few of these data points were collected on reel-to-reel. So here's a little bit about the crew. They've been up there for, just about 14 days. They've done the science experiments. They got the space lab in the back. They've done some really great science. The title of the event was Microgravity. It was all about microgravity. And they did some really great work. And, you know, it was one of these things where, you know, if you remember the Challenger when it went, we had the teacher in flight. And every kid in every school was watching the TV, and what a horrific event that occurred. And they actually saw the explosion on takeoff, you know. And that's when the seal on the external tank was, you know, interjected from the solid rocket motors. It was compartmentalized, and when the seals broke, heat went right out of the solid rocket motor into the liquid fuel external tank and exploded. Well, these guys are coming back. They don't know anything's different, and you can hear some.
And don't forget about the stuff on page 3-44.
This is about.
Right, we're checking out. We got the flight controller power on. We're working through the rest of it as well. Thanks.
They're going through their checklists.
Sounds good.
You can see they're putting on their gloves. Still talking. Actually, Casey Chawla is, you know, filming with one of those little kind of cameras that have a little tube that cops put underneath the door.
This is amazing. It's really good.
Looking out there, and this is plasma. This is normal burns that they would see.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to be
Pathetic
outside now.
that Rick Husband happens to say, "I don't want to be outside."
Good point.
5 minutes, obviously, that's exactly what happened. We were able to recover the film. I mean, some of the things that we recovered, I could see checklists that were completely intact. You think on reentry it'd burn up, you know. There were, and I'm not going to be gross about it, but we recovered all the bodies, and they were, you know, for the benefit of the families, and some of those astronauts who were tagged to be able to be family, you know, take care of the families. It was a horrible experience for them. A good friend of mine, who I just retired from being the executive director for the Wings of the Rockies Museum in Denver, Colorado, and he was on a board. And he was telling me the stories about trying to take care of the families. I mean, all that stuff. We did recover, you know, all 7 of the astronauts. But the fact that you could recover a checklist, that wasn't burned, and recover that reel-to-reel recorder that I mentioned to you as a case in point. So here's where we are. We're on February 1st, January 16th is when they launched. Columbia reached the interface. They're pretty much over basically Australia. And this is what it looks like on a reentry. You can see there, the angle of attacks, I'll talk about that in a minute. The yaw, it's got speed, 16,000 miles an hour, Mach 24 plus, the height is, 900,000 feet. They basically do a split us over Australia because that's how they come down. And the way they turn the shuttle, I mentioned, the only fuel they've got is retro rockets that they're doing. Now, for demonstration purposes, we, cut out the wing here as a case in point. Now, all these green things that you see, those are sensors, okay? Now, some of them worked and some of them didn't because, again, this is a vehicle that was built 22 years before this time frame. And it's interesting, NASA had a funny color code. Green was good and blue was bad. Okay, you can see where green up here is good, and then, when you start getting off nominal or, something's going wrong, then you'll see that going forward. So you're going to see some of these sensors pop different colors. Of course, the hit is here, all right, and then, they're coming back down, and as they start making the reentry into the atmosphere, they're still up there in pretty much a vacuum, but they're starting to get, 7,000 degrees. It's starting to hit the shuttle on the leading edge and on the belly because they're coming on down. Now, one thing I'll just mention real quick. You see the yaw here. They're trying to get to Florida. They're not trying to land in California. And you'll see that, that they're basically going to be rolling to the right and rolling to the left to correct for a yaw on reentry. And this is all done on autopilot. So the picture I showed you, the crew there talking, going through the checklist, the airplane, the shuttle is being flown by itself, on autopilot. Bottom line is they will make some corrections on yaw to get to Florida, as a case in point. Now they're crossing over Hawaii now. We're at 13:42 Greenwich Mean Time, so 42 minutes after the hour. On the hour, we lose the shuttle. So they've got about 18 minutes before they're in trouble. Again, they have no idea that there is a problem. So they're coming in, and you'll see this is early on Sunday morning, which was a gift actually in some cases. Here's where that heat, this is our simulation of what we know to be the case, is starting to eat away at that panel number 8 that took the hit with the 1.2 pounds of foam. Remember, force equals mass times acceleration. Everything's got mass. Everything's, with acceleration, you got a force. And it hit with, 500 foot-pounds of pressure. If you look at the checklist that NASA said, it could accept a hit at 0.005 foot-pounds of pressure, not 500 foot-pounds of pressure. So here we are. You've got Mach 24. You're up there at 250,000 feet. You're coming on down, and it rolls with retro rockets to be able to make a correction on the yaw. It's 0.2, 0.1, but obviously makes a big difference when you're that far. You're coming up on the coast of California early in the morning, and you're going to see California, basically the coastline come up. Again, the crew has no idea. And by the way, sometimes I get questions. The crew could not see that part. Okay, they couldn't look out the window and see panel number 8. You could see the other ones on the outer part, but they couldn't see panel number 8. Not that they were looking, because they had no idea that there was a problem. So as you're coming on down, I'm going to show you, we came across, interestingly enough, amateur photographers, people do this, they filmed the recovery of the shuttle, and because it was on a reentry in the morning, they thought they could see it at night, kind of a dark situation. So there are people south and north of the flight path of the shuttle actually taking film. Now it's interesting, you're going to see here in just a minute that there's going to be some recorded elements of debris coming off. Again, they have no idea that this is happening. It starts before they hit the coastline in California, but the people who are filming obviously are on dry land. So we had no idea that this was going on. Somebody brought it to our attention, a couple of months into the investigation. So we put an all points bulletin out. So anybody's got any film of the shuttle, on the recovery for Columbia for the accident, please send it to us. And people were sending us their equipment, their film, except for this one idiot wanted $200,000 for it. So we ended up calling the FBI, knocking on the door, and he gave it up in 2 seconds. Takes all kinds of people. So here we are, still Mach 23. You're coming down at 234,000 feet per minute, California. And you can see some of these the sensors now are popping different colors. Okay, this is based on the recorded information we got back after the shuttle. And some of it was being transferred, not much of it was being transferred telemetry down to Kennedy and Johnson Space Center, okay? But a lot of it is being recorded by that reel-to-reel that we were able to recover. So here we are now coming across. Now you just have the borders there for demonstration purposes between different states. So flying California, Nevada, Utah, and eventually Texas. You can see that the debris is coming off, and I'll show you a little bit about that here in a minute. We actually have some of that film, but that heat goes through the top. See how it pops out? This is our best estimate that it actually broke out through the top. Now, they still have no idea that there's an issue because the shuttle's still flying on autopilot, it's still maintaining the bank as it's programmed. They're not aware that there's a problem, but there's debris falling off of it, as I'll show you here in just a second. So 8 debris, 9 debris, 10 debris, this is all things that we've been able to see. Now they're at Mach 21, they're still up there at 200,000+ feet. 12 debris, New Mexico. And you're going to see the sun and the moon rise, actually, here in just a minute. And you're going to see a pattern that we put out where the debris was collected on the ground in Texas. But there's been debris. So now it rolls over here, at basically 50 minutes past the hour, okay? And then 57, 58 minutes. And they're still coming in, but now this heat is starting to take in. They probably didn't know anything was wrong until, obviously the shuttle started rolling again and pretty much a quick list. Those little bursts of energy you're seeing are retro rockets trying to keep it on the yaw at 0.7 to get it to California, to Florida. Now, just for demonstration purposes, we put a debris pattern out here. Obviously, they didn't see that, they didn't know, but this is where the debris really started coming down when the shuttle broke apart, and we lost the crew. So 59 minutes, 21 seconds, there's the moon, early in the morning, and we lost the crew. So here's a kind of a encapsulation. These are all sensors. Remember I said green is good and blue is bad? So coming in at 44 minutes when they started making the split S over Australia to start coming down, heading towards Hawaii, that is when everything was still nominal. This is 44 minutes past the hour. Okay, remember I told you it's pretty empty inside that shuttle. The carbon on leading edge is only a 1/4 inch thick. So, at about 8:48, left wing leading edge sparse strain gauge, we determined later on at panel 9, between 8 and 9, it was somewhere between those. 20 seconds later, the temperature sensor that we got after the recovery. This is this reel-to-reel. Now, here's the story on the reel-to-reel. You got to admire the engineers that we put together to be able to put this. You know how you have an accident, you see it on TV, they try to assemble all the parts and put it in a hangar. Well, we found a hangar at Kennedy Space Center and started assembling all the debris. When they found a piece of debris, we had Boy Scouts out there, we had forest rangers, we had volunteers, we had airplanes, we had helicopters, trying to pick up as much debris as we possibly could. We really wanted to find that reel-to-reel, and we couldn't find it. But when they kept placing it, all the little pieces together, they said, listen, we found this piece, and that reel-to-reel should be right between the two of them. They couldn't find it. Then we sent them out again, and sure enough, they found it under a tumbleweed. It was right side up, not burned. About that much of this whole reel-to-reel, thousands and thousands of feet of reel-to-reel was burned. And had we not been able to get that, we were pretty sure by that time what we knew to be the fact that probably caused. But this thing, when this spike came in that heat, on the seconds there. That proved to us that that was the panel, that was the issue. And the heat just kind of went through the leading edge of the wing, through the kind of the panel that was for structural failure, and went through there. It kind of went from here and then went all the way through the wing. It really confused us there for a while because the first data we got was somewhere around down here about the elevons that were saying wrong. So, my God, it must be down there. No. What it does is it cut the cable that had the sensor down to the trailing edge. And that concluded. But you can see, you can almost walk around this thing. There's no fuel inside the wing and go for it. So it was pretty clear to us that we were coming to a final decision of what caused the accident. Technical cause of the accident. Telemetry data and emission control. And we did wire burn throughs and so forth and so on. We did get one call from Kennedy Space Center where they got a telemetry reading on the temperature, because they're always worried about the tires, that there was a excessive, not a nominal reading in the heat on the left wheel well. But they kind of blew it off because those sensors had gotten old and they really didn't pay too much attention to it. But they did make a call to Rick, husband, and said, hey, we got an anomaly. Nothing we can do. I mean, it's not like they can go back up to orbit again. They have no fuel. They're a glider. They're coming down. So it is what it is. But they still were not worried about it, because they had seen false readings before as they go for it. But this was a true reading. So here we are at 59 minutes past the hour, just about on the hour. And this is the trajectory you can see from California all the way to Texas, as a case in point. You can see what the abnormal readings on the sensors that we were able to determine, were going on, and we lost the shuttle on the hour. So we put a search team together. It was an amazing group of people, 30,000 personnel, 130 federal, state, and local agencies put together. We had helicopters, we had airplanes, we had sensors, we had IR readings, we had, basically we were able to recover not quite 40% of the debris. And I'm sure there's going to be hikers and there's going to be hunters that will be going in California and all that. They'll be continue to find pieces of the shuttle as it goes along. But you can see 37 helicopters, hundreds of millions of dollars now put in there, and we're still only able to recover about 40% of it. This is the trajectory. Now you can imagine if this had happened over Dallas, we probably would have a different story. But here's another amazing story. Not one piece of debris hit a house, a car, an animal, or a person, which really was a godsend, because you can see this debris pattern. When we were in Nacogdoches the first day after the accident, holding hands, saying a prayer, it was incredible to be able to see that happened and there wasn't more destruction on the ground. This is some of the video that was taken. I'm just going to show you this part. Here you can see this part here. These are some of the amateur photographers that were doing their thing. This is a shuttle coming in, because it is at heat, but even then you could see where pieces were starting to fall off. So the people who were on the camera going, what is that? What does that mean? In fact, it just happens to stand, see that dot to the left? That's Mars. Just happens to pass right just about the time, but you're going to see where a piece comes off right there. And there were two helicopters that were up in Texas, and they were Germans flying American-trained helicopters in the States here. And this is what one of them, not the helicopter, but somebody else got some video here, but I'll show you. This is what these guys had. They had an infrared camera on a helicopter, and they wanted to track the shuttle. And they go, oh my God, what is that? Well, those big ones are probably the three main engines on the shuttle that are breaking up. But so we had that for a conclusion in our investigation. So we did our typical thing, placed the pieces that we could recover in the right place. Quite a bit. This is actually the left wing, not the right wing, because it's upside down if you want to think of it that way. And there was not much that we could recover on that regard. So the in-depth testing and analysis, foam analysis, all that stuff. The RCC and now reinforced carbon-carbon, tile, aerothermal, wing spar, forensic testings, all of that only led to one conclusion, and that it was the foam. We did the aerodynamic tests, thermals, timelines, imagery, debris. And then, the evidence clearly was panel number 8, thermodynamic pretty reinforced what we were doing. Temperature timelines, imagery, very detailed, had a lot of great support from a lot of great engineers. We were independent as an investigation, but we did have NASA engineers helping us to be able to put this together, as well as other engineers that we hired. Now, here's the thing about human nature. Even after all that, we still had engineers at NASA that said, no, it couldn't have been the foam, So what we did was we set up a mock-up in Texas. Now, some of you are familiar with the chicken gun. We put a chicken in a gun and shoot it at canopies to see if it'll withstand it. By the way, the chicken's dead. I just always have to make that clear to people sometimes. And so we restructured the left wing, and these are all wood, okay? And here was panel number 8 taken off Discovery. Now, Discovery was the oldest shuttle that we had of the 4 that we started with. That was one of the 2 that was still. So we took that panel off Discovery, put it on this thing, and shot the chicken at this thing. Now, we did it the right angle of incidence, the right impact, the right airspeed, the right mass, and this is what it looked like. Now, this is repeated over and over. Now, obviously, it didn't put a hole in it like that on takeoff, because if it did that, they probably wouldn't have made it to orbit, okay? But we're down at sea level, as opposed to, being up at high altitude, where we get a lot, less density. So, but after we did that, even the most hardened opponents to saying that it wasn't the foam finally concluded they agreed with us. Now, these are some of the things that we determined not to be a factor. Look at that. There's the crushed foam, space weather, payloads, willful damage, like terrorism, orbital major foreign object damage. And, there's a lot of debris up in space, so we had to eliminate that as one of the causes as it goes forward. So let me now go real briefly into some of the technical, that's the technical story. Now we're going to culture management and organization things. Every organization's got a history. Now, from Challenger to Columbia. Now, Challenger occurred in 1986. Like I said, this is 2003. They flew 87 successful missions between Challenger and Columbia. There was a little bit of this, been there, got done that, got the T-shirt, a little bit of a perfect, environment. When I take young people to combat in Iraq or Red Flag, I never worried about them the first week because their antennas were high, But after a while, they get into this thing, been there, done that, got the T-shirt. That's when, leaders need to be able to have their antennas as high as they possibly can get. But here's what the budget is. And where do you think the money went? The money went to the space station, okay? The priority was not to the space shuttle, as a case in point. So the shuttle budget was reduced by almost 40% over this time frame. That was one major concern. The history, the shuttle was supposed to be retired in 2006. This is, 2003, okay? But then they moved it to 2012. Then they moved it to 2020. That shuttle was going to fly for another 17 years, and we know that it flew to 2011, okay? So this is 2003. The shuttle before they retired, like we have Discovery out here, was in 2011. Fluctuating attitude towards investing. And if you don't remember anything about this briefing, I think you remember this because you probably have heard the term. It's normalizing deviance. It was written by a woman named Diane Vaughn, and she did it on Challenger, wrote this book, and she coined the term normalizing deviance. Now, I'm going to tell you a quick thing that happened. We had press conferences every week. Now, it wasn't always on TV all the time because, it was kind of getting us through the thing. But toward the end, we were pretty prominent on it every week going. Sally Ride was on our board. Now, she's the only one that was on the board in Challenger in 1986 and on Columbia. So one astute, journalist asked a question. Sally, you were on Challenger, and now you're on Columbia. What do you think? And she said something very prophetic. She said, I hear echoes of Challenger. Now, I want to bring you back to 1986. Horrible thing, teachers, kids. They called the Rogers Commission. Secretary Rogers was a former Secretary of State, but Reagan picked him to be the investigating officer. And there's another story there because NASA started doing the investigation, and Jim Beggs was head of NASA, and if you ever know that name, and he got indicted on Thanksgiving Day for a total bogus reason. He was cleared, but Dr. Graham took over, who was the deputy, and he had never really been in charge of a large organization. And then when Columbia happened in January, when Challenger happened in January, we were spinning left and spinning right. I happened to be on a fellowship at that time, so I was pretty close to what was going on. And then finally, Reagan couldn't take it anymore because the guy was not doing as good a job as he should have been doing because he didn't have the experience. And then they brought Secretary Rogers in, made the investigation, and so forth and so on. So Diane Vaughn writes this book, Normalizing Deviance. And what it really means is you just say, well, it's like Russian roulette. You take the gun, you shoot, nothing happened. Do it again, nothing happened. Well, I guess if I squeeze the trigger again, nothing's going to happen. Well, not always the case. So foam had been coming off the shuttle since day one, and they had done a lot of research on how to do that. The peppercorn, you heard that term, pieces of carbon coming off on the bottom mainly, well, it turns out that this specific junction, bipod, came off the shuttle, launched before Columbia, all right? Now, you got to give credit to NASA. There were 750 single points of failure. A single point of failure is loss of crew, loss of shuttle, or both, okay? They were concentrating a lot on the engines, the three main engines of the shuttle. And, basically the foam had taken a really low priority. But it's one of those things where, and I will tell you, there's a lot of water cooler conversation going on in NASA where people were concerned about that piece of foam that hit the left wing, because some people thought that looked like it really hit hard, kind of deal. They weren't necessarily worried about losing the shuttle. They were worried about the gear being lowered, okay? Because they had to blow the gear down through the carbon on the bottom of the shuttle, okay? And they were worried about that. But the truth of the matter was much more serious. But, culture is a funny thing. It's a basic values, norms, and beliefs and practices, and NASA got into a culture. They actually had talked about having the shuttle being used like an airline on turn. They were going to privatize it, and go ahead. And it was pretty clear to us, but, and it was clear to some other people in NASA that it still was an experimental aircraft. And even though it had been flying for 22 years, whenever the shuttle launched and came back, it was a different vehicle. A lot of it because of carbonization and oxygenation and things like that. But bottom line, it still was an experimental vehicle as it goes along. Now, there were foam anomalies, like I said. Here's STS-112. Now, this was 107. The numbers all get jumbled. But remember, this one got delayed, for, a good year and a half. So on just the November launch on 112, this same piece had come off. And it hadn't got to the point where they're really studying it yet, trying to figure out what happened. And, of course, when it came off, it didn't damage the shuttle. So it's like the Russian roulette, So the decision-making issue, I remember I assembled all the key players in the leadership team that made the decision. Now, here's another quick story about the culture. When Challenger happened, NASA has this thing where they get everybody on the webinar, even back in 1981, when they first launched Columbia. Johnson Space Center, you're ready. Kennedy Space Center, you're ready. Also, you're ready to launch, ready to launch, ready to launch. Mashoud, they go around the table. But it was interesting. One guy raised the issue about the icing in 1986 that was going on because it was a really, really cold day. But they were behind. They decided and they determined that it was safe to fly, and obviously it wasn't. But the attitude was, two gentlemen are here. So you say, ready to fly. You say, I got a concern. So the attitude was, you have to prove us wrong, okay, before we're going to stop the shuttle from being launched. Now, they fixed that after Challenger. And Columbia went around, ready to launch, ready to launch, ready to launch, ready to launch. Then you have an issue, okay? Then now the attitude is, we have to prove you wrong. See, it changed, okay, to the better. However, it didn't change on reentry. They do the same thing. Kennedy ready to re-enter? Yes, 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 yes. And then if somebody had a kind of an issue, again, you have to prove us wrong. That culture didn't change over. Now, the shuttle couldn't stay up there, can only stay up there for 21 days. Why? Because not oxygen, not because they got a clogged up porta potty, is because of the carbon dioxide, basically refiltering. So even if they knew there was a problem. Now, here's a question I get every single time. What could they have done if they knew there was a problem? Obviously, they're up there. They got a cracked left wing. Could they fix it? No, you can't fix it because you're in zero gravity. There was no arm. And by the way, the arm couldn't go underneath the left wing anyway, as a case in point. And but you have to stand on something and able to stuck. If you had a bunch of phone books, you could stick them in there or something. Maybe that would last. But the bottom line is the only way that this could have happened was a rescue. Now, Atlantis was on the shuttle launch pad, ready to go after Columbia came back. That was the plan. So you could have launched 2 astronauts and recovered the 7. Now, some of them were sitting on the floor. They wouldn't have seats, but at least, and you would have been you could have done an inspection like this. You see on the thing where the guy's holding his guy's feet, But the bottom line, it would have been one of these where you got a shuttle, maybe transfer people one at a time, then bring them back. Would they have done that if they knew there were a problem? I'm convinced they would have. But you can see with the president or the head of NASA or anybody else trying to make the decision, we don't really know what happened and, what caused it. We think we know it was the launch, but what happens when we launch another one and it gets cracked? Then we'll lose 2 shuttles. And it was a national security issue, trying to use the shuttle to get the satellites up, some classified programs, things like that. Anyway, bottom line is I do believe they would have launched a rescue because there's a philosophy flying in any of our airplanes. We never leave anybody behind. Even if you shot down somebody in Vietnam, we send in helicopters, and sometimes we lose the helicopters, sometimes we lose the A-1Es or whatever it was in Vietnam that was trying to help to recover the pilot. But we would do it, But that would be the only thing. But we didn't know. Nobody concluded that there was a risk. So we never really got to that conversation. Okay, and I'll just kind of end up here a little bit because I know I'm running out of time. This is another thing that kind of affected. This is a chart of NASA, and I'm going to enlarge it for you. You see the blue there? That's one guy. Talk about multiple hats trying to save money. So the fox was in the chicken coop. I asked a question one time where we had them all assembled there, leadership team. I said, "What is a safety person?" He was the 3rd row up, and if you want to think in military terms, you got a general at the head of the table, NASA, he's civilian, but he's not a military. Sitting at the head of the table. This guy's a one-striper, okay, up on the top left. You think he's going to raise his hand and say, "Hey, I think I got a problem here, and that was one of our recommendations. That was fixed because now there's a safety person at the head of the table who's got equal rank as well as all the other major players. That kind of shook us up a little bit. That was what Sally Ride was talking about insofar as echoes of Challenger, still there. And then system effects, failures of foresight, there was budget issues, there were cultural issues, normalizing of deviance. Put all that together, the culture, management, and organization had a history, decision-making, organizational structure, system effects, all of that played a part, an equal part to the technical issue of what went on. So it was, the history was a politicized agency. They were cutting budgets. They were prioritizing things. It was one of the things where the senior leadership in NASA, God love them, they were doing the best they could. We asked the question, well, you were putting pressure on people to get this airplane, this shuttle in the air and things like that. And there was pressure being put on people because of the space station. They said, no, we weren't doing that. But you know what they did? They had a time clock down in Kennedy Space Center that had how many hours and days that would go till the space shuttle would finish building the space station. So there was pressure, and people felt it on the ground. So even as a commander in the Air Force, I was always sensitive to the issue, even the youngest people being able to say, are you being pressured by whatever, to be able to do it. And then while the leadership thought they weren't pressuring them, the truth of the matter was it was happening. Okay, there's a lot more to talk about, but I will tell you there were 19 were 29, I'm sorry, 29 recommendations that we made, okay? Now, I'll just tell you one final story. We have a press conference. We give the report out to the press an hour ahead of time. So they're actually looking through the report, okay? And we had a press conference. We're all lined up from the board. We're getting questions. And one guy finally gets up and he asked a question that we knew was coming. And what we said was of the 29 recommendations, 19 of them had to be fixed before the next shuttle launch. A lot of it had to do with the technical element. But the others didn't have to be fixed before the next launch. Well, this guy raises his hand. Whoa, 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 whoa. He says, now wait a minute. You have 29 recommendations here, and you're telling me that, half of them almost don't have to be fixed before the next launch? What's the deal with that? It all had to do with culture management organization. Now, you know as well as I know that if we had them, start right away, pick it up from where they left out, there probably would have been a bunch of pencil whipping and the national security issues would have been in place and all that other stuff. So we had things that needed to be fixed, okay? Before the next launch, we had things that needed to be culture management. I wasn't worried about the next launch. In fact, I volunteered for the next launch because it was going to be the safest launch ever in the shuttle because everybody's going to double check things 3 times over to Sunday. But bottom line, I was worried about the 10th launch and the 12th launch after that because that's when we start getting into the been there, done that, got the T-shirt again. And that's where we did establish we were only 13 members on the board. There was almost a 40-person return to flight group. And then some of you know General Fogelman. He was on that board and some of the astronauts we had and all that. So we knew that they were going to be monitoring our recommendations to make sure that they were all done, and they were all done. So thank God, we flew till 2003, didn't get to fly again until 2005, and then we stopped flying the shuttle in 2011. And now we're back where we are now today. So I always end up with this, the cause of exploration and discovery is not an option we choose. It is a desire written in the human heart. We find the best among us, send them forth into unmapped darkness, and pray they will return. They go in peace for all mankind, and all mankind is in their debt. That concludes our briefing. Good. Thank you very much. All right, Chess, question?
There's no time for questions.
Anyway, I'll be around, and obviously for the rest of the day, and I'll be there tomorrow night, obviously. So if you have any questions, please come on up, and we'll take care of it. Thank you.
That's great.
Good. Okay. All right.
So let's take 10, and then we're going to have our lit panelists come up and tell you about their stuff that they're writing. They're getting notified of great work this weekend or this week tomorrow. Take 10, breathe, talk to people.